Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. Bertrand Russell's 1905 paper on denoting is historically a significant piece of the development of early analytic philosophy. It introduces us to his influential theory of descriptions, which is ultimately an attempt to use some of the advances in mathematical logic to get at the relationship between thought and object, between the word and the world. He sees it as having significance in the theory of knowledge, specifically in the knowledge of what is not known by immediate perception. It can be a difficult read, especially at first attempt, because its appearance can make people wonder what he is doing and why, and what it has to do with philosophy, and why we should even care. Yet Russell does explain these matters, so let's take a look at it. He starts off the essay with, by a denoting phrase, I mean a phrase such as any one of the following: a man, some man, any man, every man, all men, the present King of England, the present King of France, the center of mass of the solar system at the first instant of the 20th century, the revolution of the earth round the sun, the revolution of the sun round the earth. Thus a phrase is denoting solely in virtue of its form. And so to get at this form in a more definitive way, let's have a look at the examples of denoting phrases that he gives us and see what they have in common. All of these phrases are noun phrases. They denote or refer to one or more persons, places, or things. There are also 4 important differences to be noted in these 10 noun phrases. Some of these refer to something that does not exist, such as the present King of France. Some, like the revolution of one thing round another, refers to one definite and unique thing. A third is that some denote ambiguously, like a man, which does not tell us which man. The 4th difference is what makes this paper from Russell important, and where he makes the case for the philosophical significance of denoting. Some of these noun phrases, such as the mass of the center of the solar system at any given instant, is not something that we have given in immediate perception. In Russell's terms, we have no knowledge about it by acquaintance, and any knowledge we might gain about it can only be knowledge by description. In the particular case of the mass of the center of the solar system, the phrase has the strength of denoting something definite, and doing so unambiguously, and yet we still have no acquaintance with it. So he says, the distinction between acquaintance and knowledge about is the distinction between the things we have presentations of and the things we only reach by means of denoting phrases. As for the scope of acquaintance and description, it is a question of what we do or do not know simply by sense experience. It is by this acquaintance that I know something about what I am perceiving by way of my sense organs, my own thoughts and feelings, as well as memories and universal ideas or concepts. We can say that I am familiar with these things. However, objects outside of the mind, or another person's mind, are parts of what I can only know about indirectly through a process of knowledge by description. By acquaintance, the mind and object are connected. But how are words in the world connected? He says of things we can only know by description that what we know about them is obtained through denoting. All thinking has to start from acquaintance, but it succeeds in thinking about many things with which we have no acquaintance. In addition to what he says here about denoting, Russell is also signaling his adherence to the philosophical doctrine of empiricism, previously developed by Locke and Hume, that all our knowledge of the world has its origin in sense experience, or for Russell, in acquaintance. What we end up knowing by description will be founded, however indirectly, upon some acquaintance. Russell's thesis, or what he describes as the principle of his theory of denoting, will be that denoting phrases never have any meaning in themselves, but that every proposition in whose verbal expression they occur has a meaning. The difficulties concerning denoting are, I believe, all the result of a wrong analysis of propositions whose verbal expressions contain denoting phrases. What Russell does in the rest of the paper is to illustrate those difficulties and attempt to show how his approach to those difficulties is the best one. For example, one of those difficulties becomes apparent when the denoting phrase denotes nothing, such as in the proposition, "The present King of France is bald." What do we make of that? It seems absurd to declare it to be true, but is it false? How could we verify it to be false? Another option would be to adopt a three-value logic, where we declare the proposition to be undetermined, although Russell and others do not want to go in this direction. Apart from truth value, is the statement on the whole even meaningful? Is the present King of France meaningless when the present King of England, having the same form, seems to have meaning? Russell's theory is that no denoting phrase, whether we are talking about the present King of France or England, has any meaning outside of the context of the proposition as a whole, of which it appears to be a constituent. Now, when we want to describe something, we attach predicates to it. Once a denoting phrase gains meaning by having a predicate attached to it, Russell will then break down that statement into constituent parts. Analyzing the proposition with the use of a variable in a propositional function will allow Russell to show this to be the better approach. The proposition that the King of France is bald will be meaningful as a whole, and false by virtue of an existence claim. Russell summarizes his theory of how this is done on page 42, where he says, "I take the notion of the variable as fundamental. I use C at X to mean a proposition, in the footnote, more exactly a propositional function, in which X is a constituent, where X, the variable, is essentially and wholly undetermined. Then we can consider two notions. C at X is always true, and C at X is sometimes true." As for what a propositional function is, we can think of it as a kind of open-ended statement, an algebra of words or phrases, where we plug in values for the variables and get a definite proposition of that form that is about something. His point is to have a concept of a propositional function that will allow him to proclaim that any proposition of the form the so-and-so is false when this so-and-so as a variable stands for the present King of France or something else that does not exist. Russell's introduction to his theory of descriptions in this paper is his analysis of statements of the so-and-so. He then goes on to give us a symbolism of propositions, designed for his purposes herein, that involves everything, nothing, and something. He does not use this symbolism in his other writings. He wrote this piece with the idea in mind that it may be read by people who are not logicians, and creates what he thinks is an easier form. I don't find it easier than what is taught in symbolic logic, and I think his paper is understandable without it. Here I am substituting brackets for Russell's use of floating quotation marks in the text. C at everything will mean that C at X is always true. The others for nothing and something are being defined by Russell by means of that. And thus we get for C at something a confusing array of it being false, that this proposition being false is always true. It's not logically wrong, but the longer formulation creates unnecessary confusion. So I have here provided simpler formulations in blue. In black, I show versions of them in the notation of the logic of quantification theory. It illustrates the propositional function, but it is not necessary, in my view, that the reader know how to write in any logical notation. I am still providing it for anyone who finds it useful. For people not already familiar with it, Russell will break down claims in a proposition, such as all men are mortal. This is the important part to understand. We can say that what all men are mortal means, or what it asserts, is that for all X, if X is a man, then X is mortal. In a particular proposition, the proposition that some men are bald means that there exists an X, such that X is a man and X is bald. The quantifier some is here taken to mean at least one and possibly more. Russell provides us with a formulation of what C at all men would assert, namely that it is always true that if X is human, then C at X is true. He then gives versions for no men and some men and other formulations, but not for C at the man. This is significant because the interpretation of propositions containing denoting phrases with a the will become a tool for Russell's argument in justifying his claims about denoting. Denoting phrases that involve the article the are significant because they involve, when used in a strict sense, a claim of uniqueness. He does admit of one exception, where a man may be called the son of someone who has more than one son, and then proceeds to explain his general rule. Russell says that it will be advantageous to his theory if he can show how every proposition of the form "See at the present King of France" is false. This is also where we see why he wants to use some logical symbolism. He denies that the denoting phrase has any independent meaning. So instead of explaining what the F means, he will show us what is happening when someone claims that the F is G. The proposition that the father of Charles II was executed involves a threefold claim. There is an existence claim that says that there was an X who was the father of Charles II. There is also here a predication claim that this X was executed. So far we have something admitted by all, and has a standard way of being symbolized in notation, in words that there exists an X such that X was the father of Charles II and X was executed. However, there is a third claim here, that there was one and only one father of Charles II. This is an addition of a uniqueness claim to the effect of, for all Y, if Y begat Charles II, then Y is identical with X. This is the positive equivalent of saying that if Y did not beget Charles II, then Y is not X. And so the definite article the adds a claim of uniqueness to this type of proposition that normally contains only two claims. This can be shown in notation. The result of Russell's interpretation of what happens when we have an assertion of the effect, the F is G, is that whatever C might be, any C at the father of Charles II implies that Charles II had one and only one father. If that condition did not hold, then every proposition of the form "see at the father of Charles II" would be false. At this point, he draws the conclusion that, therefore, every proposition of the form "see at the present King of France" is also false. This indicates that Russell's theory can explain at least this type of language without needing to assign to a denoting phrase a meaning of its own or declare a proposition meaningless. He argues that, in some sense, his theory is simpler and does more to avoid difficulties that occur compared to theories that consider denoting phrases to be genuine constituents of propositions. The competing theory of Meinong regards all grammatically correct denoting phrases as denoting an object, even when it denotes something that does not exist, such as a round square. In Russell's view, this opens the door to violations of the law of contradiction, which a theory should avoid. It is avoided by the theory of Gottlob Frege, who Russell says grants denoting phrases both meaning and denotation. Frege's terms are sense and reference, where the sense of a term might not imply attributes. The sense is a mode of presentation that allows us to fix a term to its reference. Frege says a proper name, word, sign combination, expression, expresses its sense, stands for or designates its reference. Where a name such as Odysseus has a sense but not a referent, it may still be true or false depending on its sense. In the end, for Frege, there are only two references, where true statements refer to the true and false statements refer to the false. Russell argues that the present King of France ends up denoting the null class. He says it is artificial and fails to give an exact analysis. Russell expresses on page 47 the position that a logical theory should be tested by its ability to solve puzzles, in a way analogous to testing scientific theories by experiment. He gives three puzzles that any theory of denoting should be able to solve. And the first is, if A is identical with B, whatever is true of one is true of the other, and either may be substituted for the other in any proposition without altering the truth or falsehood of that proposition. Now, George IV wished to know whether Scott was the author of Waverley. And in fact, Scott was the author of Waverley. Hence, we may substitute Scott for the author of Waverley, and thereby prove that George IV wished to know whether Scott was Scott. Yet an interest in the law of identity can hardly be attributed to the first gentleman of Europe. Now, the basis of this puzzle is Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. If A and B have all the same properties, what is true of one will be true of the other. Applied to propositions, it is the idea that if A and B have the same truth value under all possible conditions, they are interchangeable. They have substitutability salva veritate, or preserving truth. In arithmetic, for instance, given that 9 minus 2 equals 7, I can say that 10 is 3 plus 7, or I can say that 10 is 3 plus 9 minus 2, while preserving truth, given that 7 and 9 minus 2 are identical. So if Scott and the author of Waverley are substitutable like this, we can conclude that the question of whether Scott wrote Waverley is a question of whether Scott was Scott. So a theory of denotation must be able to explain how it can have the proposition F is G not necessarily indicate F equals G and not make them interchangeable. In Russell's view, in the proposition that Scott was the author of Waverley, the meaning of the author of Waverley must be relevant. It is because this proposition has a property that is not also possessed by the proposition that Scott was Scott. Under Russell's theory, a denoting phrase is only part of a sentence that has no significance on its own. And he says that if I say Scott was a man, that is a statement of the form X was a man. And it has Scott for its subject. But if I say the author of Waverley was a man, that is not a statement of the form X was a man, and does not have the author of Waverley for its subject. Russell then proceeds to explain in action what he means by denotation. In propositions where we say Scott was the author of Waverley, and we specifically mean that Scott was identical with the author of Waverley, it becomes the claim that one and only one entity wrote Waverley, and Scott was identical with that one. Broken down or put into logical form, we once again have that uniqueness claim. That is a claim that for all y, if Fy, then y equals x. Or that if it is always true of y, that if y wrote Waverley, then y is identical with the x that is Scott. Scott then becomes the denotation of the author of Waverley. To try to sum this up in ordinary language, I think we can all agree that Scott is not really identical with the author of Waverley, no matter what the puzzle may suggest. We never wonder about this identity issue if we say that Russell is an author of Principia Mathematica, or say that he was not a bald man. So should a second the, starting off the predicate, not have the same function of not necessarily making the two terms interchangeable? If we want to say and mean only that there was a man Scott who wrote Waverley, the identity claim made is not the same as it would be if we say that Scott was Scott. The two are different kinds of identity claims, one of which is really just the attribution of a property. Yet if we include the idea that Waverley had only one author who was him, giving Waverley that property, then Scott and the author of Waverley become substitutable terms. We have looked at what happens when someone claims that the F is G. Given that the F is G, we cannot infer that the G is F, and say, for instance, that the executed man was the father of Charles II. Many men have been executed. If Russell is right, it is because the existence and uniqueness claims may not apply to the predicate term. Yet it can happen in this case that the two can be substituted, if and only if we mean that one man wrote Waverley and it was Scott. Then we make a uniqueness and an identity claim of the predicate as well. That makes Scott the denotation of the author of Waverley in what Russell calls a primary occurrence, where the scope of the proposition extends to the end. But when that scope does not extend to the end, there is no genuine constituent author of Waverley that can be substituted for Scott. Now let's look at the proposition in question. George IV wished to know whether Scott was the author of Waverley. This wish to know does complicate matters. The meaning of the sentence as a whole changes into something that has a curiosity as its subject. There is an ambiguity here that is important to note, and fits in with what I was just explaining. The ambiguity has to do with the fact that there could have been, although there was not, more than one author of Waverley, and we do not know whether George IV was aware of it or curious about it. Russell says that this proposition can be interpreted in two ways. The first is to say that George IV wished to know whether one and only one person wrote Waverley, and Scott was that person, which is normally what people mean according to him. The second way is to say that one and only one person wrote Waverley, and George IV wished to know if Scott was that person. So there is a question here about whether one person writing Waverley is within the scope of the wish to know. When there is one author of Waverley and George IV wants to know if it was Scott, Russell classifies it as a primary occurrence that the author of Waverley has. The scope of the proposition extends throughout the sentence to extend a uniqueness claim to both constituents. When George IV wonders whether one and only one man wrote Waverley, and whether it was Scott, we have a secondary occurrence. A uniqueness claim is only asserted or taken as granted regarding Scott, and the scope of it ends there. This framework allows Russell to quickly and easily dispose of the other two puzzles as well. The second puzzle is that by the law of excluded middle, either A is B or A is not B must be true. Hence, either the present King of France is bald, or the present King of France is not bald, must be true. Yet, if we enumerated the things that are bald, and then the things that are not bald, we should not find the present King of France in either list. Hegelians who love a synthesis will probably conclude that he wears a wig. That's kind of a side note, but I like that little shot at the end. What Russell needs to do here is to show that his theory allows for both propositions about a non-entity to be false. The distinction between primary and secondary occurrences allows him to do it. Here is where we find how Russell applies this distinction to propositions that just state the F is G without someone wanting to know about it. Let's say, as he does from page 53, that C in single quotes has a denoting phrase of the term having the property F. Then the proposition that C has the property phi means one and only one term has the property F, and that one has the property phi. So he tells us that if now the property F belongs to no terms, or to several, it follows that C has the property phi is false, and for all values of phi. In other words, we make a false statement when we say that something that does not exist has a property. Thus, the present King of France is bald is certainly false. In a primary occurrence, any proposition containing the present King of France or any other non-entity will be false. However, propositions that contain the non-entity in a secondary occurrence have a possibility of being true. If the proposition that the present King of France is not bald is taken to mean the equivalent of, in Russell's formulation, it is false that there is an entity that is now King of France and is bald, then it is true. This is logically proper negation of the original proposition that ends up containing the denoting phrase in it as a secondary occurrence. If, however, when saying that the present King of France is not bald, if I really mean to assert, in primary occurrence, that the present King of France has hair, it must be false. Russell's explanation is that it would make a claim that one term that has the property of f also has the property of phi, when in truth the property f belongs to no terms. He says, therefore, we escape the conclusion that the king wears a wig, and the puzzle is resolved. The third puzzle has to do with a proposition that says that A differs from B. There is or there is not a difference between A and B, in which case we can form two propositions to affirm or to deny that the difference between A and B subsists. But how can a nonentity be the subject of a proposition? It would appear to be self-contradictory to deny the being of anything, but to admit the being of what does not exist can also lead to contradictions. Russell's theory, as already explained, tells us how to deal with nonentities as subjects of propositions. He says on page 53, if A and B do differ, then there is one and only one entity X such that X is the difference between A and B is a true proposition. If A and B do not differ, there is no such entity X. Russell tells us that the way his theory deals with any nonentities, the round square, Apollo, Hamlet, the revolution of the sun round the earth, is to consider them to be denoting phrases that do not denote anything. Propositions stating something about them are all false in a primary occurrence, but can be true in a secondary occurrence. In his view, we have no need to grant nonentities a denotation by creating a null class that has no members, or a class that has unreal members. Russell's theory of definite descriptions gets developed more fully in other works. His theory of descriptions was influential and was criticized by P.F. Strawson, who developed an alternative in his 1950 paper on referring. Russell had himself admitted to an exception to his rule of the uniqueness of the so-and-so, to the effect of the son of someone who has more than one son. Strawson uses the proposition, the table is covered with books, as something other than a counterexample. In this case, he says the uniqueness claim for the table only comes from the use of the sentence, within the context of time and place. For Strawson, the truth value of a sentence is in the use, with sentences used to make a true or false assertion. Russell confuses use with meaning. What Russell shows in his breakdown of claims is only the necessary conditions for the proposition being true, which Strawson accepts. As for myself, I'm not sure that it makes sense to say that a proposition can have necessary conditions for its truth being attributed to it if it can't have a truth value. Either way, Strawson believes that Russell created an inadequate analysis of the use. He believes it is consistent with this, that a proposition about the present King of France does not make the existence and uniqueness claims that Russell attributes to it. Strawson also argues using an example that the King of France is wise. In different reigns over time, he says the proposition has different uses. However, to be fair to Russell, he talks of a present King of France being bald without ever denying that such a proposition may have been true at one time. He puts it into a context of time. Strawson makes other objections to Russell's analysis. What many people, including myself, will like in Strawson's piece, though, is the end. He says, neither Aristotelian nor Russellian rules give the exact logic of any expression in ordinary language. For ordinary language has no exact logic. Russell is looking to examine a perfected language, making uneasy translations when necessary, while in ordinary situations, we just take the position that if the other person understood it, that's all we need. Russell effectively admits this when he says on page 43 that when he says, "I met a man," he in practice means a definite man, but his theory makes it indefinite. Later in 1952, a translation of Frege's Über Sinn und Bedeutung was published under the title On Sense and Reference. All three are available in anthologies. As for myself, I see Russell's analysis as being a simple explanation that can take different uses into account much of the time. It can be argued that more than one of these theories does what it is intended to do. The criticism that I would have of Russell has to do with his empiricist assumptions. It is difficult to see how Russell could potentially advance our knowledge with an analysis of the relation between word and object, when he does not claim to know the world independently of language, and he cannot therefore stand outside and check the results of his method. Hume struggled with issues of causality, the continued existence of objects, morality, personal identity, and created a skepticism that ultimately removes metaphysics from philosophy. Although Russell did not seek to create an elaborate metaphysical system, he did show at times some intellectual confidence on some metaphysical issues. In Lecture 8 of his Philosophy of Logical Atomism, he says that bad metaphysics has been due to bad grammar. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, check out my other videos, hit those like and subscribe buttons, and thanks for watching.